thanks to all of you for joining us. I know it's quite late in the evening for some of our partners, but we're very pleased that you can join us today for this second webinar. As a note, the first webinar was recorded, and so you can access that webinar through the link that I shared with you over email last week, and we will likewise record this webinar so that you can share it with your colleagues if you wish to do so. Joining me today for this webinar on message development are our colleagues from Vanguard, Stephanie and Brenda. I'm going to turn it over to them now to begin the webinar, but please don't hesitate to ask any questions via the chat box as we proceed.
Hello and welcome again, everyone. My name is Stephanie. I'm with Vanguard Communications, and I'm here with my colleague, Brenda Foster. We're both delighted to be with you today for the second webinar. We were with you last Tuesday, and today we continue that conversation and are really excited about the opportunity to share more thoughts with you with regard to audience and messaging, and we hope you get a lot out of it. I just want to begin by taking care of a few housekeeping items. First, to let you all know that you'll have opportunities to ask questions throughout the webinar today. We're going to be stopping every 3 or 4 slides to give you that opportunity. But as questions emerge for you, please don't hesitate to use the chat box to go ahead and send us your questions. And once we come to those stopping points, we'll take the questions that are already in the queue in the chat box, and then of course welcome any others that come during that particular Q&A session. But again, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions and share thoughts throughout today's 90-minute webinar. We also want to remind you that the French and Spanish language PowerPoint decks are available to you. You should be able to see those presentations. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, Anjali is correcting me. We're going to actually send, following this presentation, forgive me for the confusion, following this presentation, we're actually going to send you the PowerPoints in French and Spanish. And so you'll have access to those materials as well for those of you who prefer to review the materials in either of those languages. So again, thank you for joining us, and we will get started. I'm going to get started by handing you over to my colleague, Brenda Foster.
Thanks, Stephanie, and hello, everyone. I wanted to introduce myself. I am a Senior Vice President at Vanguard Communications, and one of my specialties is strategic communications planning, which is what we're all working on together today, and particularly message development. So I'm really excited to be working with all of you and helping you figure out ways that you can best engage your audiences with persuasive messages. And we're going to go over for a second just some of the learning objectives for today's session. So the first objective is that we're going to talk about the connection between audience and message development, meaning that for each audience that you're working with, and there are so many across the various countries, that each message really needs to be as tailored to them as possible, and understanding how they think will help you figure out a way to talk to them more effectively. We're going to talk about some guidelines for message development and construction, meaning some ways that messages we know messages are more successful, and some ways that we know messages can become garbled or hard for audiences to understand or hard for them to accept. We're going to talk about the importance of identifying barriers and benefits of an audience acting on a message. So when I say barriers and benefits, what I'm talking about is there is an amount of information that audiences will accept, and sometimes they like to know that there's something in it for them. There's some way that they will benefit by what you're asking them to do or what you're telling them. Also, as many of us do, audiences can come with preconceived notions or reasons that they are probably not going to accept a certain piece of information. Significant part of this discussion will be about how to get over those barriers and how to emphasize the benefits of the work that you're doing in your countries around budget transparency. And then finally, because there's so much data involved, particularly in the world of budget transparency and all of the different comparisons among different nations, we're going to talk about how to incorporate data into storytelling and message development in a way that can be persuasive to audiences, but not overwhelming. So those are what we're going to cover today. Hopefully we'll meet all of those objectives. And to start us off, I'm going to send it back to Stephanie.
Okay, thank you, Brenda. And as you just heard Brenda say, we're going to start making the connections between audience and messaging. And this is the next step on the strategic communications planning wheel that Sangeetha and I introduced you to last week. And as we discuss, then your key audiences and the work that you do in identifying and understanding and prioritizing those audiences really should be the driving factor in your message development process. Everything flows from the knowledge, understanding, and motivations of your audience. Effective messages seek to motivate your audience to respond positively or productively to your call to action. And again, there's that phrase that we talked about last week that we're going to continue to talk about quite a bit today, the call to action, very important. In our case, of course, that call to action is to respond to your country's OBS survey score in a way that seeks to strengthen your country's budget transparency, accountability, and participation. So in continuing on to dive deeply into message development, we're going to take a look at the next slide that really asks us a series of questions, asks us to examine a series of questions that are the most helpful to ask yourself based on what you know and have learned about your key audiences. Helpful questions are questions such as these. What is important or relevant to your audience or audiences? As those of us who were able to join us last week recall that we really recommend no more than 3 key audiences to focus on at any given time during a strategic planning process. So what issues are important and relevant to your key audiences? What would they find most compelling? What is going to motivate them to think, feel, and act in a certain way? What are the barriers to their responding in the way that you would like them to respond to your message? What are the benefits to them if they respond as you would like them to? What is culturally appropriate? What kinds of things are tied to their values, beliefs, interests, and customs? And what will they consider memorable? Those are some of the key questions that we encourage you to ask as you're beginning to work through your message development process. And so when taking a look at the next slide, we kind of reflect that as we discussed last Tuesday, you can begin to answer these questions by learning as much as you can about your key audiences, really diving deeply into your key audiences. And that's where audience research becomes very, very important. And we talked about this again a little bit last week. And there are different methods for learning about your audience, for doing that research. And you can research them by sending questionnaires to people who represent your audience, a brief questionnaire that really reflects what you're trying to understand about them. You can also have a focus group, host a focus group that actually uses perhaps some of the questions that were in your questionnaire if you wanted to do both. Obviously, resources are often tight and you can only do one or the other, but know that if you wanted to do both questionnaires for certain groups and then a focus group for others, you could do that using similar questions. And so you would be able to stretch those resources in that space. And it doesn't need to be a whole lot of questions for either of those groups. You can limit your questions to just the number that you need to discover how to motivate your audience to respond to news about your country's OBS score and the way that you would like them to respond. You could use groups with regard to focus groups. You could use groups of anywhere from 3 to 6 individuals who are either members of the audience that you seek to engage or have extremely close ties to those audiences and know them very, very well. For example, we mentioned aides or staff last week. You can also use one-on-one interviews with any of those groups that we just discussed. You can study existing research. This gives you the opportunity to perhaps collaborate or partner with like-minded organizations that may have access to research that you don't, and you can do the same for them as part of the same effort. That existing research will also help you study the public statements of finance ministers in your country, as well as the public statements of their audience with regard, or of their, their offices rather, with regard to open budgets and budget participation and accountability. Those finance ministers and other government officials have often made public statements that will give you a sense of what they're thinking, give you a sense of what motivates them, give you a sense of where their priorities are. And that's the kind of information that would be most helpful to you. So we're gonna pause for questions at this point. We're gonna move forward on the next slide and talk about message construction in a minute, but this seems like a good place to stop and pause for questions and hear from you and hear what questions and thoughts you may have at this time. I don't see, do we have any questions in the queue? No, it doesn't look like we have any questions in the queue. So again, if you do have a question, we're going to give folks a couple of minutes. Please feel free to go ahead and write your questions in the queue, and we'll address them. Okay, so it doesn't appear that there are any questions right now, but that's okay. We'll go ahead and keep moving. And in the meantime, as I said, as questions come up, please don't hesitate to write them in the chat box. And the next time we pause, we'll address those questions and take any others that emerge at that time. So moving on to the next slide, in which we're talking about message construction. Once you pull together all of that information that we recommend that you collect and gather as you are researching your audiences, we recommend that you keep in mind some of the following things that you see here as you begin to develop your key messages and throughout the entire process of message development, because it's a process that's never really over. You're constantly refining based on new information, based on all of the things that you learn about your audiences. You know, some of the principles, the core principles are going to be the same no matter what. However, there are going to be opportunities to refine those messages as well. So it's an ongoing process, and that we think it's helpful for you to keep these message construction thoughts in mind as you go through that process. And so some of the things that it makes sense to focus on, considerations for message construction, include clarity. Your messages should be clear and straightforward as you can make them. Consistency is another important issue. You want to avoid messages that contradict your goal, of course, with the very first step on the strategic communications planning wheel. You want to avoid messages that contradict your goal or may contradict other messages that you have already shared. You should also be sure that the main point of your messages are consistent regardless of who's sharing those messages or when they're sharing the message. You don't necessarily have to use the exact same words every time, but the main points, those key messages, should always be consistent. It's also helpful to consider the tone and appeal of a particular message as you're going through the development process. Is the tone inspiring? Is it informative? Do you acknowledge the progress that has already been made with regard to open budgets as part of your messaging? You may want to think twice about messages that sound as if you're scolding or shaming the audience. We talked a little bit about this last week as well. In American English, we might say that a message sounds preachy if it seems to scold or shame. And so you want to do as best you can to be candid, but keep it in a positive space. Is the message credible? Does the message seem credible? And what makes it credible to the audience? And that's something that's important to think through as well, because some audiences are going to consider some messages more credible than others based on their experience, their knowledge, and so forth. Does the message clearly make the connection between open budgets and serving the public needs? Ultimately, that is important, critically important, as you're reaching out to these different audiences. And last but certainly not least, does the message contain a clear call to action? There, that phrase is again, call to action. Inspiring and motivating your audiences and getting them excited about something is great, but ultimately it's not helpful if you don't give them a message that gives them a clear call to action, that tells them what to do in response to what they're thinking or feeling, especially if their thoughts or feelings have changed with regard to a certain issue. So it's really important to make sure that your message contains that call to action, gives people a next step, something they can do, to move forward in support of budget transparency and accountability and participation in your country. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we share some examples a little bit later. And I'm gonna, at this point, pass it back to Brenda.
We have a question.
Question. Awesome.
And it goes back to slide 6. They want to know about, could you please elaborate on partner interactions?
So partner interactions have so much potential to be so helpful to you in the message development process, because your partners or organizations with whom you collaborate can help you in a couple of areas. I mean, they can help you in the areas that I mentioned specifically with regard to if they possess existing research on the audience that you're trying to reach. If they share the same audience as you, they might have existing research. They may have had resources to do a deep dive in learning about that audience. They also might have close relationships with members of your audience, whether they be finance ministers or monetary institutions or donors or so forth. If those partners have existing relationships and you can develop a good collaborative relationship with them because of those existing relationships with that audience, they can be of assistance to you in your message development. And then finally, they can also help you through whatever platforms or outreach channels that they have. They can help share your messages. Now, obviously, the idea is that this is a reciprocal relationship. These organizations, in that space. You can help each other develop messages. You can help each other reach audiences that perhaps one organization has more access to than the other. And so those are just some ideas on partner engagement or partner interaction that may be helpful to you. Does that answer your question? Are there any other questions? Okay.
Oh, yes, there's another.
All right. Next question that comes up. The question is, hi, consistency of messages between different audience groups is quite a problem when using public, not creating conflict between message sets. So I'm going to start this and then I'm going to kick it over to Brenda because I'm sure she's got some responses on it too. What I would say is that when we talked, for those of you who were able to join us last week, we talked about segmenting audiences into key audience groups, and each audience may get information that they consider reliable and credible from a different place. And so I think that, or from different places. I think that part of using public media, as you say, is determining what audiences, say you have 2 or 3 audiences, determining which forms of media each audience considers credible. If you are looking primarily at finance ministers and finance offices, they're going to pay more attention to certain media outlets, certain publications. In the US, we would talk about things like Wall Street Journal. There's also the London Times. There's also the Financial Times. Those are the kinds of media outlets, and their broadcast outlets, CNBC. Those are the kinds of media outlets that particular audience is probably going to pay a lot of attention to. Obviously, they're also going to pay a lot of attention to the media in their own countries, clearly. And so that's one space that you know that the messages that you're creating that are consistent, the core principle of those. When you're talking about an audience, so audience 2, for example, perhaps they pay more attention to issues related to the broad base of good governance or philanthropy or developing world issues. They're going to pay attention to different kinds of media. They might, occasionally look over at that London Times, but often they're going to be getting their news from different sources. So again, core principles will be the same to ensure that consistency, but the language that you use in engaging those media and reaching those audiences is going to be slightly different. Based on the fact that you know that those audiences are going to different sources of information, or going to different channels rather, to get their information. Brenda, was there anything you want to add?
Sure. I mean, that is essentially one of the solutions, is to use different channels, different message vehicles for your different audiences. But the other thing I will say is that consistency is important. But the most important thing is not conflict. So in other words, as long as within the same article, you don't give 3 messages that conflict in an effort to hit 3 different audiences. So your messages, when you look at what your messages are, and sometimes what we talk about constructing a message map, meaning I sit down and I think audience 1, that's government officials. So I'm going to say finance ministers, the main message for them is that it will help people better support their government. And then underneath that, I'm going to write down 4 or 5 phrases that use data and use some of the other things that Stephanie talked about to make those arguments. I'm going to do the same thing for every other audience. And one of the reasons you want to do a message map is so you can see all of your messages in the same place and see, wait, so am I saying here to this audience that it will build trust in government, but am I saying to this audience, for some reason, that it will hurt trust in government? Well, you wouldn't want that. Now, obviously, that doesn't make any sense. You wouldn't have a message like that. But that's the kind of conflict you would. What I would say is, in media where there are several audiences who might pay attention, I mean, high-level officials, policymakers, philanthropy audiences may all read the same types of things, whether it's, international business publications, things like that. But they will filter for themselves what means something to them, as long as it doesn't offend them. So I think about one of the biggest trends in media these days, because we consume things so quickly, is that there are often what we call listicles, meaning that an article will say, here are the top 5 reasons why you should do something, right? When I read that article, sometimes I only see 2 that appeal to me. The other 3 I say, that doesn't matter to me. I don't necessarily believe that. But if you give me, of the 5, if 2 of them work for me, then that may be enough for me to support the effort. And so that's one of the ways, if you think about, that's how audiences really do absorb news articles and media things. So when you're looking at a media story, as long as there's nothing in there that you would reject as an audience, that it doesn't necessarily grab you is okay. You're not hurting your audience as long as there's something in there that they can attach themselves to. All right, that was a great question. Thank you. Any other questions? If you can send us, samples of messages to different audiences, this would be helpful. Very interesting that you say that, because that's exactly what we're going to talk about next. But certainly, we'll take a look and see if we have other samples that we can send after as well. So before we get into this first example, I want to talk generally about messaging. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with examples where instead of you thinking about being the messenger, I want you to think about you as an audience, because sometimes it's easier to think about things that happen in your own life personally as a member of an audience and think about that kind of messaging and how you feel about it before you start to put yourself in the role of messenger and have to understand your audience. So that's how we're going to start off, and then we'll move on to your role as messengers. So the first thing I want to talk about is that a message is a conversation between messenger and audience. But here's the challenge. The audience, there's no give and take, meaning that the messenger gives the message out, but you have no idea how it's being received until it's out there. And so sometimes you find out through negative feedback that it was wrong, or you find out that that the audience didn't pay any attention to it, or even worse, the audience had the opposite reaction to it that you wanted them to, and they actually did the opposite of what you wanted. So I want you to imagine for a second, if you're thinking about how messaging works, if you were to say if an audience were to hear fruits and veggies are good for you, you put that out there and you say fruits and vegetables are good for you. Well, what if I'm the audience and I think I don't like fruits and vegetables? So it doesn't even matter that you said they were good for me, because my barrier is I don't like them. Because messaging is an unheard conversation, you're going to keep saying fruits and vegetables are good for you, and I'm going to keep thinking, you'll never hear me say it, that I don't like them. And so you keep saying they're good, and it happens. It is literally a wall that I've put up, a barrier wall that says it doesn't matter that they're good because I don't like them. So what you have to do is you have both sides of the conversation in your message. Okay, so that's how you get over that barrier. So for example, what you might say is, after you've talked to your audience, the way that Stephanie has mentioned, all those different ways that you learn about your audience, and you find out they don't like fruits and vegetables, then your message might be, there are many delicious ways to prepare healthy fruits and vegetables. So within that message, I have told you that they're good for you. I've also told you that they can be delicious. So it's possible that when I hear that and I think I don't like fruits and vegetables, perhaps I didn't realize that there were some delicious ways to prepare them, and maybe it's worth looking into delicious ways to prepare them, because apparently they're also healthy. About how would you have a conversation with your audience if you were doing both sides of the conversation? That's really what you're trying to do with messaging. So what I want to talk about now is something that many countries around the world are familiar with, and that is Starbucks coffee. So the message that Starbucks wants to convey is that they are a socially responsible company creating space for people to enjoy beverages and gather as a community. All right, and we pulled this from all of Starbucks materials, and so we know that's the message that they are trying to convey. But for some people, you see Starbucks and you might see something else. Well, that's when Starbucks tries to enter a country, they take a look at that country and they say, what are the barriers in this country for getting messages across? And so we're going to look at the first one. Let's go to the first example. Okay, so we're going to take a look at when Starbucks wanted to come in Chile. So in Chile, people saw Starbucks as a large corporation, an impersonal chain that really just wanted to sort of take over the world and become something that threatens local culture. And so Starbucks, understanding that they had this barrier, in Chile, they emphasized the incorporation of local art and materials in Starbucks shops. And so For example, in Chile, they use local materials like wood and marble. They designed a mural to depict Santiago city life. And so when you come in, it feels like Starbucks understands who you are. That this really could, if you sort of think about what Starbucks said, which is that they want people to be able to gather as a where people could gather, that felt like it understood the local people. Now, Starbucks has actually started implementing this around the world because they find that barrier in almost every location. So if you have a Starbucks in your country and you've been in there, take a look around and see, does it look like your country? Does it emphasize the culture or the art or even the materials that your country represents? I'm going to stop for a second because I see a question and I don't want to go too far. So, okay. So an example message map given some standard OBS audiences, finance ministers, government officers, would be very helpful as a draft to work off of. All right, so we'll take a look at that and see what we can come up with. I think if we could even just talk about some of the barriers and benefits. One of the things I want to say is we can give you examples like that, but because every country is so different, we want to be careful not to give you examples that wouldn't apply to your country. So we'll do what we can, do an example that you can work from yourselves. So thank you for that, and we've taken that down. Oh, there was a question before that. I did not see. Oh, got it. Okay. What are the specifics of use of tone and appeal construction element if we send messages to Prime Minister representatives? Oh, good one. Well, that's and again, I don't know all of the specifics of every single country, but in the countries where we've worked, we would look at the tone as respectful, congratulatory where you can. If you can praise what the government has already done while telling them things that they can continue to do or do better, that will tend to go over better with government officials than if you are simply slapping them on the wrist, if you are scolding them, as Stephanie mentioned. So that's important. Data that they will trust is incredibly important. So tone and appeal, they want to know that there's been good research. They want to know that that you're coming from a spot of real deep understanding, and that you appreciate. There's an appreciation factor that I think they all. You come in and they feel like you think they're ignoring a problem. Again, they're not going to listen as well. So I think tone and appeal really is, again, if you think of messaging as a conversation, if you're in a room with a government official, how are you going to act? You're probably going to dress your best, right? You're probably going to make sure you know the formal customs and etiquette of meeting with a government official. These are all things that you want to do in your messages as well. So think of what is the conversation that I might have in person, and the tone and appeal of your messages should really match how you feel you would interact with that person in dress, in habit, and in etiquette. Right? Let's see. All right. So keep those questions coming, and we'll keep stopping for them. I want to move on to the next example of barriers, to give you another example of how they get over barriers. So one of the barriers, and this is a big one, this is huge. One of the barriers is that a lot of countries believe that Starbucks exploits coffee growers. And so Starbucks wants to make sure that people understand that they do care about them and the areas that they come into. So they have emphasized their partnerships with local growers and fair trade policies. So it's almost like if you think about a reason why you might go into a Starbucks or you might not, again, think of yourself as the audience, not the messenger. Starbucks has talked to every single person who might or might not go in and figured out what is it that would keep you out of Starbucks. And so in this case, there's a large group of people who feel like they probably aren't fair to local growers. So in Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Tanzania, they have promoted the fact that they are using local beans from farms in those countries. In Colombia, because that's such a huge coffee country and there are so many conflicts there around what happens to local farmers and the rights of local farmers, actually opened a farmer support center where they're helping farmers in Colombia get their farms in order, find new markets, and other things that farmers might need to be successful. So again, this is sort of looking at that mainstream example of how you might get over barriers, right? So if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in and I'll take a look at them. But we're gonna move on to, now I want you to imagine that you're the messenger. Again, we're not gonna talk about specifically the IBP yet, but this one is gonna be much closer. So the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation wants investors to know that the investments in their investments in the fight against global poverty have an impact. They want to know that, you know, when people give money to the foundation for that purpose, it's actually working. So in India, the foundation is focusing on the ways that we can increase access to financial services to improve the lives of the poor, particularly women, okay? So if you take a look at that, then what would the barriers be for that? If you think about what might get in the way, we've taken a look at that, and so did the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so the first barrier that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation found is that India's regulators, banks, and government, in order to do any kind of investment in women, they need to know that their investment in financial inclusion is actually impactful, that it makes a difference. So again, if you take a look at their message really was, cultural norms have historically inhibited women's ability to make economic decisions, connect with the financial system. Data shows, right, so this is a government, we're talking about data. Data shows that when women receive wages into their own bank accounts and have access to mobile banking, they earned, saved, and worked more. So overall, that's better for the family, that's better for the economy, and it's better for India. And so they want to know, okay, we did this so that we could help women, and certainly with data, we have now proved that it does help women. Now, the next one was a barrier for the banks, because the fact is that banks are not nonprofit organizations, they need to make money. And so there's not really a motivation for banks to invest in poor women who usually make small or infrequent transactions. So again, getting over that barrier, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation looked at digital banking and they said, look, if you help women do digital bank accounts, then you don't have the costs of brick and mortar banking, and it will expand access to financial services. And so people in rural areas and women who have limited mobility have the same access to financial services through mobile banking, and the amount of money that the bank has to spend to get that money is reduced. It becomes much easier for them to serve that population. Okay. Alrighty, so I want to move to just a way that they've expressed some of this. So we're going to talk a little bit about data later on in the presentation, but I want you to take a look at the way that they show data to the two audiences we talked about, the policymakers and the bankers. So if you take a look at the impact, it showed the control group, people who did not receive wages directly into their own accounts, and people who did, and it shows how much more money they earned because they were able to put the money in the bank. And so same thing, really, if you're a policymaker, take a look at that second piece of the bar chart. The control group, the people who did not receive wages directly into their own accounts, only made 2% of their purchases from their own income. The treatment group from their own income made 13%. So suddenly you're able to show in a very transparent and obvious way that doing this actually helps the economy. It helps that women can become an economic driver, even poor women. And it shows that the investment in programs themselves. Okay, so one of the other things that I want to talk about before we talk specifically about the issues you're dealing with is other ways that you can give messages. So in addition to these bar charts, one of the other things that this website showed is they have a video that tells the story of a widow and a mother. She borrowed money from a self-help group to open a beauty parlor. She can check her account on her phone and make deposits or withdraw money. She's able to provide for herself and her family. So the reason that you want to give your messages in many different ways, including whether you can do a video or write a case study or show a picture with a caption, is that no matter who you are, you receive messages differently in different ways. So I might react much more to the story of a mother and her child than I would from a bar chart that shows me about investments. So it's important to know your audience and how they like to receive information. It's also really good to give it to them in a few different ways. In case one doesn't work, the other one will help persuade them. All right, so I'm going to stop for questions and then we'll talk a little bit about barriers to budget transparency messaging. Any questions? Oh yes, if you want to go ahead and put them in the chat box, I'm watching for those to come up. Okay, please feel free to enter them at any time, but I do hope that that means that what I'm saying is helpful and comprehensible. So the next thing I want to talk about is specifically what all of you are dealing with, and that is thinking about what are the barriers to budget transparency messaging. So if you think about the governments, the prime ministers, the high-level officials, the finance ministers that you're dealing with, some of the things that are going to be barriers for them, one is going to be that it will invite scrutiny, right? So sometimes people want to be transparent, but they're a little bit concerned that being transparent, okay, let's look at this as innocently as possible. At the very least, they may be concerned that you're going to find something that maybe they didn't notice, or you're going to not understand something that is in the budget that they publish, that their audiences won't, and that it will cause them more trouble than if they just don't say anything. On the less innocent side, they may very well be not wanting to show people things that they promised they would fund but didn't actually fund. And so a barrier is that being more transparent would invite scrutiny. Another barrier could be that among all of the priorities that these audiences have, they don't know that budget transparency should be one. They don't see budget transparency as a priority. If they're dealing with huge human rights issues or economic issues, things like that, they're not really, budget transparency isn't something that's so obviously tied to the work that they're doing. So when you think about those couple of barriers, the first is the inviting scrutiny. The messages that you need to come up with are ones that talk to them about how being more transparent allows the public to give them more of the benefit of the doubt. They're less likely to believe that they're hiding something, so that if mistakes are made or there are issues that are found in the budget, a conversation can happen versus anger and resentment and other things as the public finds out, or other organizations find out that there were mistakes. So transparency helps build trust. So that's a really good one for inviting scrutiny. So the priority, really what you need to think about is, how does budget transparency help them deal with the other priorities that we have? What are the connections? If it's human rights, are there things in the budget that they're going to want to show people that they're doing to help with that? by showing it? Are they showing that they do care about their publics and they are trying to give them as much information as they can? Does that help them, again, build trust? Another barrier is that they are concerned that they'll be blamed, or they're concerned that it will affect their reelection. Again, when you take a look at what the benefits might be, because that's what you need to do, is take down those barriers, take down those walls, and figure out, are there ways that being more transparent may help them with their reelection? Again, that public trust piece is incredibly important. It also may be that their barrier is something simple, which is that there's way too much bureaucracy and they just simply don't have the staff that they need to be able to put it out there. So intent can also build trust. If you can encourage them to talk about their issues with being able to publish the budget and get them to maybe start on a plan for being more transparent over the course of, say, 3 to 5 years, so that they can do that more quickly or build the resources that they need to be more transparent, then you have an opportunity to start a conversation rather than having them, again, just shut you down and not participate in the budget transparency process. That's it for me for now. I'm going to move on to benefits. Stephanie?
Thanks, Brenda.
Thanks, Brenda. So we're going to move through the benefits portion at a fair clip because we want to, in a few minutes, hear from Laura Castillo from the Dominican Republic. And she is a colleague of yours, a country partner. Her organization is a country partner of IBP. And she's going to be telling us a little bit about how she and her team have had the opportunity to apply some of the principles that we've been sharing with you so far. So let's briefly move through the benefits because it's certainly an overlap with what Brenda just shared. And again, we remind everybody that if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat box to share those questions. And so emphasizing benefits and messages. So Brenda talked a little bit about this and what you're asking yourself at this point as you're emphasizing benefits in your messaging is that what will your audience gain if they change the way they think, feel, or act with regard to open budgets and open budget policy. So whether you're talking about government officials, finance ministers, financial institutions, donors, so forth, any of those obviously could be part of your key audience groups. What would they gain by changing the way that they think, feel, or act with regard to this issue? What's the benefit to them? And really reflecting on that and incorporating that research that you've done on your audiences to get a sense of what they feel like they would gain. Incorporating those things will really help you. It will, and so some of the questions or some of the examples of what they might gain could be, as Brenda mentioned, will it help them achieve certain policy or programmatic goals? Can they make the connection between the work that they're doing with regard to infrastructure in their country, or the work that they're doing with regard to education or healthcare, those public service needs? Can they make the connection between open budgets and those issues? If they can, chances are they're going to see the benefit for the work that they do. They're also going to see the benefit for themselves with regard to their influence on public policy and what their teams and departments are able to do. As Brenda mentioned, if they are elected officials, we know in some countries finance ministers are elected, and we also know that in some countries that they're appointed. However, they are often connected to the election process in some way, whether they're elected or appointed. And so a benefit for them is that, you know, they're responding to your country's OBS score in a way that's productive, responding to your message in a way that's productive and positive, can benefit them by getting them reelected or getting their party reelected. It could earn them votes. That's an obvious benefit in their case. Moving on to the next slide, we want to share a little bit more of another example for you. Last Tuesday, for those of you who were able to join last Tuesday, we talked about Oxfam International, and it's behind the Brands campaign. And if you recall, the idea behind this campaign was to influence food industry giants like Kellogg, like Coke, like Pepsi, Dannon, and so forth. Influence them through their their main audiences, which are of course their customers and their consumers. And the idea was to convince them, using their customers and their consumers as a channel to carry messaging, convince them to change their business practices in such a way that allowed them to be more responsive and respectful to the needs of the environment and to the needs of people. You know, how are they trusted? How were they treating the planet, and how are they treating people? That was the key questions that behind the brand's campaign asked, and encouraged these food industry giants to make a change with regard. And so they offered areas of improvement. Oxfam offered areas of improvement or critiques, but then they also offered praise, and they gave credit where credit was due among these companies that were already doing this work, or at least moving toward being responsive in this way, and with regard to social responsibility. And so they knew, Oxfam knew, that consumers, customers of these companies could carry these messages, could assist in their development, and could carry these messages to these companies, because if the companies were going to listen to anybody, they're going to listen to their customers. Moving on to the next slide, and we see a really sort of colorful representation of the messages that Oxfam developed, in sort of a bit of a message map, if you will. In this example, they developed messages that reached those food giants, General Mills, Pepsi, Nestle, Coke, and so forth, that were coming from lots of other different organizations that were brand owned their favorite product. And so it might be a little bit of difficult to see in the slide, and we apologize for that, but you see the smaller boxes that are connected to the big boxes. This really they shared this map, if you will, with the consumers, the people that they were trying to get to influence the food giants, and showed them, look, you know, your favorite product is made by this company. Is your favorite product a particular type of yogurt? You see it on this map, then that's how you know which company you need to be connecting with and seeking to influence and engage, because that's the company that makes your favorite product rather. Moving on to the next slide. So I find this particularly interesting here with regard to the message strategy in the Oxfam Behind the Brands campaign. And Brenda touched on this a little bit earlier as well. The message strategy behind the messages that they developed was what we refer to as a critical friend approach. So it was a friendly approach. But it was an approach that held the food companies accountable, but held them accountable in a way that was positive and encouraging and not scolding. And so, as might be different from the way that you might think about a situation like this, or the way that these situations have played out in the past with regard to influencing big companies, multinational companies, they didn't go for the boycott strategy. They didn't start there. They didn't go for the heavy hit with regard to boycotts and very confrontational and maybe in some cases, as we've seen, even belligerent confrontation of those companies. They didn't do that. They went with that critical friendly approach, that said a critical friend approach that was more positive, more strength-based, as you'll hear people who do what Brenda and I do, phrase that you'll hear us use. But not about that immediately, that they didn't go immediately to the heavy-handed, confrontational, belligerent type of action. They worked with the companies. They developed messages with realistic asks that shared an understanding, or that conveyed an understanding of the company's point of view and the issues that they had to deal with on their side, and that gave opportunity for incremental growth and incremental improvement over time. They used nonpartisan data. Most of you participating in the webinar today are researchers. You're more than well versed with regard to data, and so again, always going back to the data that shows how changing is effective, how changing is beneficial, how responding positively is beneficial. And again, finally, that positive messaging, that critical friend approach, that friend who likes you, that friend who wants you to succeed, and that friend that's going to hold you accountable in the midst of that. And so that is the strategy, the underlying thinking behind the approach that Oxfam took with its Behind the Brands. And again, they made all of those connections through their various audiences, from themselves, of course, to their consumers of the products, and those consumers of products who were, of course, being used or being partnered with to influence those big food companies. So, any questions before we toss it over to Laura? No? Okay. Well, again, the chat box is there. Please feel free to use it. And now we're going to open up Laura's mic. I know she's on the line. Laura, are you there? Oh, okay. So it looks like there's one question. Laura, if you wouldn't mind holding on just a moment. We do want to respond to this question that came up. The question is, how do we manage a trigger-happy media that is quick to place emphasis on negatives rather than positives, right? Which kind of flies exactly in the face of what we were just talking about, particularly if a country's results don't look too good. Brenda, do you want to start with that?
Sure. So this can happen for sure.
One of the ways that
we often will deal with this
is that if we know information is coming out, before it is released, we will go to the media and we will give them an embargoed, meaning they are not allowed to publish it, first look at the data. Or before they even see the data, we will sit down with them. So you could be having these conversations now to talk about the importance of budget transparency, what the finance ministers are doing correctly, what they could improve upon, so that you're setting the tone for the coverage. If you wait to talk to the media until you're handing them the data, then you leave them no choice but to use their own interpretation. Whereas if you have conversations ahead of time and give them the background, then you have the opportunity to help shape their understanding and their thinking around a particular issue.
Excellent. Thank you, Brenda. That was a great question, because that is something that's going to come up quite a bit as you do this work. The media is going to, as you make the point in asking this question, really going to zero in on what seems to be the most attention-getting, on what is often sensational, what is often emotionally driven. So really setting the tone before they have the opportunity to do that, so you're not constantly in an offensive mode, is a method that is likely to be helpful to you. Any other questions before we move over to Laura? Okay, Laura, are you there?
I think David is going to unmute Laura.
Okay.
And
Good
Laura,
morning.
then you could try the mic.
Good morning. Can you listen to me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you are. As Stephanie said, I am Laura Castillo, the OBS researcher for the Dominican Republic. It is a pleasure to be sharing with you briefly about Fundación Solidaridad experience regarding key message. First of all, I must stop and talk briefly about our key audience. For the dissemination of the OBS survey and the results for the Dominican Republic, the key audience was firstly the citizenship and its social organizations, to which it is concerned to raise awareness about the budgetary issue. And then we had the government, specifically the finance minister and the general direction of budget, which are the main bodies responsible for directing the budget process. Finally, we had the Congress. And for our first audience to respond favorably to the message, certain barriers had to be overcome. The main barriers were and still, because it's a constant work, are related to the technicality of the language on of the budget issue, which generally is a challenge to get the ordinary citizens to easily grasp the message and its relationship with aspects that directly affect his life. In addition to this, there is the mistrust that can cause the government to interpret the recommendation and the results of the OBS survey has criticisms of its opponent, and no has a positive way. In the other hand, about the gains for the citizens and its social organizations were a better knowledge about the budget issue and the possibility of influencing, so that the resources of the budget were managed according to the international standards on transparency. For its part, the government, in accepting the recommendation, could produce changes to improve its score and change its position in the Open Budget Index in the following measurement. So in the elaboration of the message, an effort actually was made to bring that technical language to a friendly and understandable level to the common citizens. So the message could reach easily and was well received and understood. This was accompanied by a broad dissemination of the citizens' budget and published by the General Direction of Budget, and that, as you know, is a document that explains the budget in an easy, understandable way for the citizens. And this was complemented by an educational campaign addressed to the public through short message, posters, brochures, video, to social networks on the national budget and its relationship with citizens. In this regard, I can change at the end a link of a video that we produced as part of the dissemination of the OBS 2015. So you can watch it later with the clarification that the video is in Spanish. So maybe not everybody can understand it, but I hope so. It is good to emphasize that the recommendations are handled with a positive approach that have indication about the failures, but also they make suggestions how to overcome them. This generates confidence in the message and recognition to the seriousness of the work done by IBP and Fundación Solidaridad. Regarding the use of the available data, we use the IBP ranking, the graphs, the table of the control summary that were more friendly and they were more timely. Mainly, we use them in the presentation and the press conference that were organized jointly with the press, that's the General Direction of Budget, with other civil society NGOs. And finally, the main results of the messaging efforts were in the long term, the publication of documents, specifically the mid-year review, which since 2015 has been constantly published, before wasn't published or produced at all. And the publication of the pre-budget statement for the first time last July, which until then was produced only for internal use. In addition to this, also there is still there is a lot to improve. The documents have been more exhaustive in this round of the OBS, and the government has shown interest in continuing to make improvement. And to conclude, in the year, IBP Fundación Solidaridad have gained recognition and respect as entity that work with professional methodology, and this allow the results to be verified, and this credibility therefore directly affects the force of the message that the message, the dissemination campaign may have. So thank you. That was my thoughts about the experience in the year.
Thank you, Laura. That was a wonderful example. Are there any questions for Laura? If you have a question for Laura, please go ahead and add it to the chat box. We have a couple of other questions in reference to our previous slides, but if you have a question for Laura, please go ahead and add it to the chat box, and then we'll come back. Laura, if you could just stay with us for a little bit longer, we'd appreciate it as we continue the discussion. I think that it's possible that folks might have some questions for you a little bit later. So thank you so much again for your presentation. Very good example, and very good to hear about the way that you approached your work in this space. We want to go to a question that actually came in a little bit before Laura started speaking. And again, another really good question. And this question was regard to how do you shift your strategy if you are in a country in which the government or the media that people have most access to is actually owned by the government. Because clearly the example that we gave with regard to Oxfam's Behind the Brands campaign may not be the best approach. That critical friend approach may not be the best approach when you're dealing with a situation in which the government owns the media and the government is the audience. And so I'm going to start, and then Brenda and perhaps even Anjali have some thoughts to share as well, and how you would shift strategy here. Because again, to your point, that critical friendly strategy is probably not going to be the best one for you in this case. And so we talked a little bit earlier about those, if the government owns the media and the government is the audience, there are two methods that you can use. So I'm going to start with the first one. The first one is really using those networks and those relationships that you already have, or that may perhaps a partner organization already has within the government, within the finance ministry, and use those opportunities to get in-person meetings with people within the finance ministry, staff members, finance aides themselves, and go to them with the score, and go to them with a tone that is collaborative, that again, as we said earlier, shows appreciation for the work that they've already done, and then shows a willingness to be supportive and going even further and doing even more and better work with regard to open budgets. And so away from cameras, away from, cameras that are owned by the government and reporters that are paid by the government, and have those one-on-one small group meetings or just straight one-on-one meetings that give you the opportunity to take your messages to people who are within the government, within the finance ministry, and so forth. Take your message directly to donors, really circumventing the government media, and taking your message offline, if you will, to donors, to other audiences, however way that you can do it, either through small group meetings or so forth, to really get that message across, to engage them and inspire them to respond to the OBS score in a way that you want, and in a way that recognizes the improvements. And so that's one way that you could approach it when you're in a situation in which the media is owned by the state. Brenda?
So the other way is a little more confrontational and hostile. but you may need it. I mean, we talk about this, we understand that there are many ways to work with country governments. And one of them is collaborative and respectful. The other is to use as much public pressure as you possibly can. Maybe this is the 10th time you've gone to your government and said you need to improve this score, or maybe it continues to go down. If that's the case, then you need to look for places that are not as restricted by the government. That may be social media. It may be through pressure, through letter writing campaigns, or boycotts, or other things that you work with your in-country partners to organize. So the media is not always your best bet. I mean, it's where we go first, right? When we think communications, we always think media. And media has a role, but they are a messenger. So you have to think about, it's one of the things you can control the least. You can do all that you can do, but the fact is that the media is going to do what they want to do to meet their own objectives. So the thinking about how do you get around them really depends on what it is that you're trying to say and what relationship you want to have with this government. Again, collaborative is one thing, and that's the approach that Stephanie described. But you may also need to take a much more critical approach because you've been working on this forever and they're not going to listen. And you may need to have other messengers deliver that information. We also have a question for Laura. Laura, if maybe you can, David, you can unmute Laura so she can answer the question.
Laura, I'm not sure if you can see the question, but I'll just go ahead and read it. It says that governments will have a high tendency to want higher scores than they might receive, of course. And this inherently means that they will be dissatisfied if you come to them with a low score. Yeah, and so how have you found, Laura, in your country, in the Dominican Republic, how have you found it's helpful to deal with the resentment that governments are perhaps going to feel when the first thing that they hear is a low score and they've already kind of built up a negative impression in their mind?
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, David, for the question. Yes, government usually have a tendency to want a higher score. I don't know the case of your country, but in Dominican Republic, the case is that and the score has increased from one round to the other. In 2012, it was 29, and in 2015 was 51. So even though they wanted a higher score, it was still significantly changed. And that's one. The other thing is, I believe that if you if your country government accept to review the OBS and they had input about it and they request some changes and they change it and how can I say it, didn't proceed. If that you justified that why those changes couldn't happen, I believe that that could help in the when the score is launched. And also, as I say, when we made the recommendations with IBP, we have a positive approach. It's what Stephanie has been saying. You don't want to like sound patronizing or like you are having a strong a bad attitude about it, but you want to encourage the government to keep making changes. So I hope that makes sense.
Thanks, Laura. This is Anjali from IBP. That was a very useful response. And I just wanted to jump in and add another comment. In some countries, you might find that it's also useful to move the discussion away from the score and focus on other survey data that can potentially highlight positive steps that the government has taken. So David is from Myanmar, and so there the score is on the lower side and has been for several rounds of the survey, and so in that scenario, sharing with government materials that, for example, show the OBI rankings or that show the OBI score in large print can potentially be less useful and can sometimes shut the conversation down. Whereas if the government has taken steps to publish new documents, which may not have necessarily resulted in a big jump in the score, but a positive one, it may be helpful to show graphics that show red dots transitioning into green dots, or even just using that information as talking points. And so the point I would like to offer is that the OBI score is only one available data point in the survey that can be used to base your messaging on, and that there can be other ways to, or other messages to sort of focus on when you're engaging with governments. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjali. And I was just going to mention on a related note, I think what Anjali just shared is a good example of a way to approach the situation when the government is not talking about open budgets at all. Certainly not talking about it within the context of a score that they may not like. Part of what you're doing, often those country partners who are participating in the webinar who have been doing this for years may have some experience in this, is to just open an avenue of communication, so that if the government does own the media, if it is state-run media, state-owned media, and the government is controlling the messages in that way, just getting them to talk about open budgets at all, to begin with, is a step in a positive direction, I think you could say. And what Anjali just shared is by moving it away from the score that they don't want to talk about, and right now, and presenting it in a space that's not so heavily emphasized on that, but heavily emphasizes opportunities for progress, opportunities for improvement, and the government may feel compelled to use a state-run media to at least tell that story. If they have never told the story at all before, if they've never acknowledged the issue before, they may experience this as an opportunity to at least tell that story, to at least open the door to make progress toward you can be there. They're willing to be, perhaps at some point, more candid about the score and having direct conversations about the score. So before we move forward, we have just about 10 minutes left, and we certainly want to be respectful of everyone's time. And so we are going to move forward, but we do want to give folks the opportunity to share a question or two in the chat box if you have one. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and move forward. I'm going to toss it back to Brenda.
Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. And we're just going to review
a little bit about data and how to use it. So we've talked about this all day, this time and last time. Know your audience, and when it comes to data, you just need to know how they need the information. Are they better with numbers? What kind of source should it be from that they're most likely to trust? Do they even like data, or are they much better at something else? You need to humanize the data. What does it mean to the average person? What does it mean to how it's going to affect the lives of the individuals in each country and the different audiences that the governments have as well? Use visuals whenever you can, and we're going to show you an example of that with reports, the red light, green light scenario that Anjali just talked about. Use restraint. You don't need to have, your sentence shouldn't have 4 or 5 data points in it, and every single paragraph doesn't have to have data. Use it as you need to prove a point. but don't feel that you need to overuse it or back up every single sentence that you say. And give some context. It's exactly what Anjali was just saying. Don't just put data out there without saying, you have, if it's something negative, that you have an 11% when the country would really rather have a 35 or a 40% on something. The fact is that the last time the country had a 2%, so they actually had a huge jump. So give them the context, don't just put it out there. Also among countries, right? So who are the countries that they respect and look up to? And how do they compare with those countries? So those are some ways that you can use data. Another couple of things to think about is to make sure that you use proportional numbers whenever possible. So 56% means a lot less to people than more than 5 out of 10. So people understand that better. They think about the 10 people around them, and they can better understand a proportional number than they can a percentage. Okay. Moving on to the next one, I just wanted to show you, we've talked a lot about Oxfam, and this is another version of a chart that's a lot like the one that you use in your country reports. So all of those different companies that Oxfam was trying to help people understand, this is a chart to see if you care about Unilever or you really want to decide whether or not Coke is a company that you can support. It gives you a sense on all kinds of different issues how they're doing. So under land, it gives a score. Under workers, so it simply isn't just a score. So the OBI score is similar. So you could do something like this that helps express that score and show people how it compares to other scores. All right. Next is, and so in addition to that score chart, which helps people understand data comparatively, we have an example of storytelling. So in other words, don't just show the score, but show what's behind the score. So they talk about, in the Unilever example, they talk about specifically that Unilever is the only company that's getting a good score for farmers. Meanwhile, they talk about Kellogg's as the company that's making huge improvements on climate. So this gets back to exactly what Anjali was saying. They're able to say, okay, maybe Kellogg's doesn't get all greens. Maybe Unilever doesn't get all greens, but here's what they are doing right. And that's your opportunity within the data that comes for your country. Beyond that big score, what are the things that they're doing right? What are the things that you can point to say they're trying here or they're not trying here? All right, so this is the last thing, and this is just some things to think about as you are writing your messages. Again, you need to think about what is the conversation that you're going to have with your audience. Imagine sitting in a room with them and think about the types of words that you would use. So the first thing is to make sure that you remove jargon. And we find as communicators that we have our own lingo and our own jargon that we often will use for things. Message map, for example. I can't just say, oh, do a message map. I need to explain what a message map looks like. Or I shouldn't talk about a message map if I can't explain it. And so jargon sometimes can be its own barrier. If people feel as though you're using words that don't relate to them or they don't understand, it becomes a barrier and they just stop listening. So it's the same with acronyms. We tend to, particularly in nonprofit organizations and advocacy organizations, we tend to give things long, important names that we don't want to use over and over again in a document because it's too many words. And so we start using abbreviations or acronyms, and then we get very used to that. So we start using them as part of our lexicon every single day, and we forget that most people have no idea what those acronyms mean. So try to limit them if you can. And if the words that you're using or the organizations that you're talking about have too long of a name, then just come up with talk about the name and then come up with a shorter way to talk about it after that. But do limit them if you're not going to define them. Any new ideas that you put out, don't just put them out, you have to give the context. We got to this point or this recommendation because of these 3 things. This is what led us to this. Think about timing. Think about what's going on in your country at the time that you're getting ready to put the information out. So in other words, is your message going to get lost? Are you in the middle of an election cycle or a celebration that your whole country is involved with? Is there a lot of controversy going on right now about something completely different so that your message will get lost? Conversely, think about, are there points at which it makes sense to have these conversations? Because there are budget talks going on, or there's a lot of news out there about budget. This may be the perfect opportunity to introduce the information. Or even over the course of time, after you've introduced the information, does something come up where you can offer an editorial or an opinion piece for a news organization that sort of starts the conversation again using the information that you have in your country report? And finally, consider the political or environmental climate. Is this the time for you to be bringing up the things that you need to bring up? What is it, if you're going to talk about them, then how can you make sure that you're respectful or understand the climate that you're speaking in? That is it on message development. I hope that this has been helpful, and we would love to now open it up to any questions that you might have on any part of the presentation for me, Stephanie, Anjali, or Laura. Please go ahead and write them in the chat box. We learned last time that opening everyone's microphone makes all of our ears hurt. So we're going to try to do these through the chat box. We want to be respectful of your time, so we'll just take 1 more minute to see if we get any questions, and then we will go ahead and give you our contact information for anything else we might be able to answer after the webinar has concluded. Okay, so let's go ahead and give you, that is our contact information. If you would like to email me or Stephanie with any questions, or Anjali, we're available. Also, if you have questions for Laura. Laura, if you want to, I can't remember if you gave your email, but if you could put your email in the chat box, that would be great. And then if you have any questions for Laura, you could, you can contact her as well. Thank you once again for joining us, and this session has been recorded and will be posted and distributed to everyone for anybody who had a chance to hear everything. And yes, the questions will come up in practice. That's right. Okay, thank you. Let me see here. One of the tasks at hand, at least for us in Moldova, will be reconciling the primary audience message with the government and the public opinion, which is distrustful of the government. And yes, yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that is absolutely an ongoing challenge in almost every country in the world. Public tend not to trust government. That is actually an essential function of a good government, is that, or of a good public, is that that you continue to question the government. And so I do think that understanding how to be helpful to the government in helping to add to the trust is an incredibly important skill to develop. So that if you look at what your messages.
The meeting is about to begin. Please go to the fourth
Your chat's on. Sorry, we just had a little interruption, but all I wanted to say is that I think it's very interesting that, in particular, the open budget process and discussion is one that can actually start to add to that trust, and it can be, the conversation can be positioned as a benefit to governments that are trying to build trust with the public. This can be a way to do that, and even if the score isn't something that they like, if together you can come up with things that the government is doing, it can start to build that trust. Now, one report or even 5 reports from one organization, it can't change all of that. But I do think that if you're able to see this as a tool for governments to be able to do that, that can help tremendously. Anything else come in before we sign off? All right. Well, I see Laura has put up her her email address. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and we're looking forward to hearing from you again next week. Is it the 17th, Anjali?
Yes, so thanks for the reminder, Brenda. So our last webinar in this series will be next week, and the next webinar will be an overview of the dissemination plan template that we've shared with you in Spanish, French, and English. And as all of you hopefully saw in my email from last week, we'll actually be running the webinar 3 times, once in English, once in French, and once in Spanish. So please do check my email for the dates and times, and register in advance for the workshop. Thank you again for joining today. We hope the information is useful in filling out your dissemination plans, and a friendly reminder to continue to work on those and submit them by October 20th, so that we have plenty of time to discuss your plans with you and hopefully offer you some constructive feedback. But we hope everyone has a great day, and we're looking forward to.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.